we have a very special faculty with Professor Rohit Saxena, who is faculty at Dr. R.P. Center of Ophthalmic Sciences at AIIMS, New Delhi. We are very grateful to you, Professor Rohit Saxena, for having made time for this program to teach the postgraduates today. Professor Rohit Saxena is academic and research committee member for North Zone, and this is his second term, and he is such a popular person that he won this time unopposed. What an amazing human being he is. More than reading out any biodata or any introduction, I must tell you that he is one of the most amazing human beings that I know, and I am very fortunate that he is our friend and that he has been with us through so many years. We are very grateful to him, and today he will be speaking on optic disc edema. So I'd like to request Professor Rohit Saxena to please start his presentation.
So thank you, Satyajit. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure knowing you, and everybody who knows you knows what an excellent person you are. So let's go on with our presentation on optic disc edema. Screen's visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, sure. So we'll talk about optic disc edema, and of course, along with that, we'll also discuss a little bit about optic disc atrophy, because both of them are kind of interrelated. But before we start edema, atrophy, the key thing to understand is how does a normal disc look? A lot of times you've discussed this, especially with relationship to glaucoma, and where the neuroretinal rim and the cupping is extremely important. But from a neuroophthalmology perspective, there are many other things that we need to actually look at. So of course, color is very important, because whatever the size of the cup and whatever the thickness of the neuroretinal rim, whatever is remnant, the color gives us the understanding about the remaining nerve fibers or their health. Of course, the size and shape of the disc per se is important, often gives us some very important clues, not just about refractive errors. If the shape of the disc is in a particular way, it's vertically oval or horizontally oval, but also about the size of the disc, because certain diseases like ischemic neuropathies, there is a predisposition to them if the disc is very small. And of course, the amount of cup would matter on the size of the disc. So if a small disc, a normal cup would be 0.6, 0.7, may just be a normal a large disc 0.7, 0.8, and a small disc 0.1 itself would be a normal cupping. So if it is a 0.3 on a small disc, you know that there is a predisposition or a possibility of glaucoma. Then of course the margins, we talk a lot about margins. It's almost always like in this disc that you can see here, the margins here and here are almost always very sharp, and you should be able to see them. It's at the upper and the lower poles that because of the crowding of the fibers, you may have issues related to the margins, but still the vessels would be seen normally over them. Only a very slight obscuration may be there. So all these are very important factors when you're looking at the margins of the disc. The cup, of course, we always see particularly with relationship to glaucoma, but we'll see again in another kind of optic atrophy where the cup may increase. The rim, the neuroretinal rim I've talked about, is an extremely important and very sensitive sign. So if there is any sectoral or focal pallor, that itself gives us a lot of ideas about what is going on with the disc. The vessels are again very important, how they emerge from the disc, the way they branch, where they are branching, and of course their tortuosity and their relationship with each other. And finally, the peripapillary area, which is again a sign of what things may have happened or any active inflammation or edema that is happening around the disc. So all these things are important when you're noticing how the disc is looking, a normal and an abnormal disc. So before we start on disc edema, let's try and understand the definitions that we conventionally use. Now, disc edema is essentially edema or fluid in the disc, but we tend to use optic disc edema when we know that there is fluid or swelling in the disc, and it may be due to any cause. So we're not very sure. So it's optic disc edema. It can be bilateral optic disc edema. Papilledema, on the other hand, is when the disc edema, we are sure, is secondary to raised intracranial pressure. They are frequently used interchangeably, but essentially when you mean papilledema, you are saying that it is there is probably raised intracranial pressure. And of course, pseudopapilledema is an apparently swollen disc, but it is not due to any edema or any true axonal swelling. So it appears to be swollen, but there is no actual swelling or fluid collected there on the disc. So these are the basic definitions we should know about. Just again, any kind of response of the optic nerve to insult or injury, in the early period, it will just swell up. And in the later period, you're going to have atrophy or pallor. So it's important for us to understand atrophy also, because it's often a consequence of a disc edema. And atrophy is a pale disc where visual functions are defective. So pallor is when the visual functions may not be affected, but atrophy is when you're actually saying that there is significant loss of visual functions. And disc pallor may not correlate with the visual functions you are seeing, and often it is the papillomacular bundle. If that is affected, you will have severe visual loss, while the rest of the disc will look normal. And other way around, you may have severe pallor, but the papillomacular bundle remains fairly okay, and the vision is fairly good. So severe pallor may have fairly good vision also. So there is no real direct correlation between the two. Now, how would you approach disc edema? So you have a patient who's presenting to you with disc edema. So the key ways of working up or looking at a disc edema is, and this is true for any neuro-ophthalmological condition, I am always, more than what I am seeing in this eye, I'm more worried what is happening in the other eye, because it gives me an idea where to localize my lesion, because that is the key to any investigational approach I want or any management I'm going to do. So is the other eye also swollen? So it's bilateral disc edema. Is the other eye actually normal? So I'm looking at a unilateral, that means prechiasmal lesion to this eye, or the other eye is optic atrophy. So something has happened to the other eye earlier and is now happening to this eye. So this is the way you can broadly divide any disc edema to. If it's bilateral, you start thinking of systemic causes. So you start thinking it may be papilledema, it may be pseudopapilledema, there's hypertensive retinopathy, it could be bilateral papillitis, could be compressive optic neuropathies, or bilateral systemic diseases that can present with infiltrative lesions, uveitis, and etc. If this is only eye that is showing edema and the other eye is normal, you want to know whether it's hyperemic or pale, but more or less you are sure that it's involving the anterior or part of the optic pathway in this eye only. So from the optic disc to the chiasma, you're having an involvement. The possibilities could be papillitis, ischemic optic neuropathy, or obviously pseudodisc edemas, venous congestions, and rarely asymmetric papilledema. So you have an early disc edema in one eye and the other eye may show a little later, and right now it's not presenting us with disc edema or papilledema. And of course, if the other eye is atrophic, one of this or something of this which we have discussed has already happened or already caused damage to the other eye. So first, whenever you're looking at, so we look at bilateral disc edema when we're starting with. Again, how to identify papilledema. So you have bilateral disc edema, whether it's true papilledema or not. Usually the key differentiation with pseudopapilledema, and we'll come back to this slide. Let's look at these photographs first. So the disc at the top is pseudopapilledema. The fundus photos in the middle are true papilledema. And here we are looking at something which often is misdiagnosed as papilledema, but is not so, or essentially grade 4 hypertensive retinopathy, which is also said to be papilledema, but that is of course not papilledema per se, in a sense that there is no raised intracranial pressure. There is ischemia bilaterally at the disc with fluid collection. So how do you differentiate these three photographs? That is the key thing to understand when you have a bilateral disc edema presentation. First, we look at true papilledema. So you can see, I mean, even on a 2D picture, although I would say whenever you're looking at a disc, never look at a disc on 2D, never use a direct ophthalmoscope for assessing the disc. Always use a 90D with a stereoscopic or a 70-80, whatever you're comfortable with. So stereoscopic disc assessment is the basis of any assessment, including glaucoma. So always look at 3D because you're looking at elevations and depressions. So here, it's obvious that it is elevated. You can't see the vessels going up to the disc. You can see a lot of exudates around. The exudates is reached right up to the macula, but this is not the typical macular star you talk about when you're looking at neuroretinitis. It's a half star, only towards, rarely even in papilledema, you may have a full star that is on the other side of the macula also, but the fluid is reaching up to the disc. So the visual loss is because of the damage to the optic nerve along with fluids on the macula here. Obscured vessels, you may see a few splinter hemorrhages. These are hemorrhages that you can make out. This is a clear, full-blown acute papilledema. In this is pseudopapilledema. Here, the disc margins are not clear, and that's why it's frequently misdiagnosed as papilledema. But the vessels are fairly okay. You can see the vessels they're branching at the middle of the disc. It's a small disc with no cup, and as soon as the vessels emerge, they branch out and they're going straight directed outwards. But the vessel margins are pretty much okay. There is no bump, or if you see on 3D on a stereoscopic examination, you won't see a diffuse elevation here, which you will see here. And finally here, although the disc also is not appearing that edematous, but there may be blurred margins because of the splinter hemorrhages and all you're seeing. But the key thing that you look at is that there is involvement of the retina, or there are hemorrhages which are totally unrelated to the disc. So this is not a disc pathology per se. There is something else that's going on. So even frequently you may have juxtapapillary uveitis or things like that, and you will find that it's spreading much further away from the disc than, like in this photograph here, everything is connected to the disc. So you can see a line of exudates here showing that it has risen from the disc. Even up till here, you can see there's a connection all over. So this is a true papilledema, whereas a pseudopapilledema on the top and a grade 4 hypertensive retinopathy at the bottom. So how do you differentiate? So most commonly we get referred pseudodiscedemas as true discedemas. So how do you differentiate? We talked about that blurred margins may actually be in both. So margin per se is not itself a hard sign of edema. You need to look at elevations of the disc and the elevation of the disc moving further away from the margin of the disc. And that, like in this case, you can see that there is no obscuration or blurring of the vessels. There are no hemorrhages, exudates, or cortical spots. Whereas in this photograph here, you can see that the vessels are obscured. There is a lot of exudates. There are hemorrhages here. There are hard exudates as it goes towards the macula. So these are key features to differentiate true from a pseudodiscedema. So when we're looking at true discedema and of course papilledema, we're looking at the key things, of course, are the other symptoms that you have. You have associated nausea, vomiting, headache. Important to do ocular motility because a bilateral or even a unilateral lateral rectus underaction or a sixth nerve palsy is something which is commonly seen in raised intracranial pressure and is a false localizing sign. We call this a false localizing sign because in neuro-ophthalmology or in neurology, any sign can, or a constellation of signs can localize to a site of lesion. So if you have two cranial nerves involved, wherever they are together, you can localize the lesion there. But with disc edema and sixth nerve palsy, you cannot localize it anywhere. There is no single place where you can actually localize it, and it's not of course, they come closer together in the orbit, but then there are two separate orbits. So it's not a single point localization. And it's because of raised intracranial pressure that there is disc edema and there is a down pushing of the midbrain, which causes a stretch on the sixth nerve. So that's why it's a false localizing sign. It may be because of a tumor somewhere in the brain, which has caused a raised intracranial pressure and presenting with this. So that's why it's called a false localizing sign. So papilledema usually bilateral, occasionally asymmetric, no visual functional loss till a significantly advanced stage, although you may have early field defects in the form of an enlarged blind spot that you can see here, or a constricted peripheral field, again a smaller field in the periphery. This of course you can only pick up, either you do a full field analysis on a automated perimetry or a Goldman or a kinetic perimetry, and sometimes by doing confrontation fields. And of course an enlarged blind spot can be picked up by a 30-2 or a 24-2. These patients will have a history of transient visual obscuration. So their vision will sometimes be fairly poor, and they will say that they have subnormal vision, especially when they bend down or whenever there is a kind of Valsalva maneuver. So causes, of course, can be anything that is increasing the content of the brain. So it could be a solid tissue like a space occupying lesion, and a fluid tissue like blood or CSF increase, like an intracranial hemorrhage, meningitis, aqueductal stenosis, or an IIH, primary or secondary to a cortical venous thrombosis. And you need to do an appropriate investigation. So most common and the first investigation of choice would be an MRI brain with contrast, and of course orbit also with fat suppression, because you want to see whether there is any thickening or enlargement of the optic tracts or the sheath of the optic nerves also. If you suspect meningitis, you would require a lumbar puncture also, and of course if you suspect infections, then you need to do other infection screen also. So a neuroimaging would help us to rule out a space-occupying lesion, would tell us or pick up signs of raised intracranial pressure like distended optic sheaths and occasionally empty sella. And of course, if there is no sign or obvious feature caused to it, and you suspect that it could be an IIH, you need to rule out a venous sinus thrombosis by a MRV. So MRV or a venogram is necessary to rule out occult venous sinus thrombosis. And if there is a high suspicion, you may require a neurologist to do a CSF pressure analysis and of course the composition analysis. So we just deal with IIH because everything else is of course the realm of the neurologist or the neurosurgeon. So if you find out, if you suspect or if the patient is confirmed IIH, an ophthalmologist more or less is the primary treating physician. You need to remove the cause. Sometimes they may be associated with systemic diseases or medications like vitamin A, excessive or frequent contraceptive use, of course weight loss, although very, very difficult, we all know, but is supposed to be a sheet anchor for control of IIH. Blood pressure, anemia, obstructive sleep apnea are key things that you need to identify. You may start on diuretics, but the sheet anchor for treatment is acetazolamide, which we give up to 2 grams a day. So 2 tablets 4 times a day is sometimes you may have to give, and fairly well tolerated. You must usually look at, they may have potassium depletion, so they need to take either syrup or chlor or other things that have significant amount of potassium. And of course surgical options if they significantly lose vision. So IIH patient will have 2 major groups of damage. They would either lose vision because of the pressure around the optic nerve, or else they will have systemic headaches, tinnitus. So it depends upon what is the reason for which they are complaining, and if it is not managed medically, then if it's systemic conditions like headache and tinnitus, they may require a lumbar peritoneal shunt, or else if they're just losing vision, which is more common and more frequently seen, then maybe we can just get away with an optic nerve sheath fenestration, which helps to stabilize vision but does not reduce CSF pressure to such a great extent. So that was for bilateral disc edema and managing the most common condition. When we look at unilateral disc edema, so you have a patient with one-sided disc edema, the other disc is absolutely normal. So you would at a glance want to know whether it's hyperemic or pale. If it's hyperemic, your conditions could be papillitis, asymmetric papilledema, of course localized orbital things like compressive neuropathy, and of course pseudopapilledema or pseudodisc edemas, and of course localized inflammations like posterior choroiditis, uveitis, intermediate uveitis, hypotony after a glaucoma surgery or a leaking bleb. So these are common things of a hyperemic unilateral disc edema. And pale disc edema would be anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. So this is broad, although it may not necessarily be easy to differentiate between the two. So these are broad conditions presenting with unilateral disc edema. A brief on optic neuritis, and I believe there is an optic neuropathy topic also being discussed 2 days later, so you will have details there. But just to identify unilateral disc edema, often optic neuritis would have pain on eye movements, typically looking superiorly, more common with retrobulbar neuritis because there is inflammation around the optic nerve sheath, and because the superior rectus gets inserted, originates very close to the sheath. On a little ocular movements, you may have pain. Optic neuritis per se, at least first presentation, is usually unilateral. Obviously, you will have reduced visual functions that may vary from just mildly affected color contrast to PL negative. RAPD is a very, very hard sign of unilateral optic nerve involvement. Whatever the optic nerve involvement, RAPD will always be present, even when the visual loss may be very transient, very less. It may just be field effects, but RAPD, at least sectoral RAPD, can be easily picked up, and it must be picked up. If you do not have RAPD, revisit your decision or your diagnosis of an optic nerve involvement or an optic neuropathy. And of course, you can see disc edema, which is very mild, not very severe, not significant capillary dilatation, a few hemorrhages, and small amount of uh, vitritis just overlying the disc may be present, but it's not a very common feature. So these are classical features of optic neuritis. And of course, you need to investigate. The key investigation is an MRI brain and orbits with contrast fat suppression, which is also called an MS protocol, because that also includes a flare. A flare is where you decrease the attenuation of the fluid. So you suppress fluid. So because in optic neuritis, when you're searching for multiple sclerosis lesions are along the ventricles, and a T2 will have a predominantly in a T2 cut, you would want to suppress the ventricle fluid and want to see the lesions around the ventricle. So that helps us to pick up multiple sclerosis. That's the key diagnosis investigation you must do, because MS, if they are positive lesions on the brain MRI, the likelihood of the patient developing MS is 3 times than not having any brain lesion. So it becomes a key diagnostic feature. And of course, it'll help you to pick up anything else that may be responsible for the neuritis, including NMO or neuromyelitis optica, which will have a slightly different MRI feature. So it can be possible to pick up these things now on the MRI. So it becomes a single most important investigation we do in optic neuritis. The management we know is from the ONTT, we learned that oral steroids, no role, no treatment, will give the same visual acuity finally. However, it is most distressing, and the treatment now is IV methylprednisolone, 1 gram every day for 3 to 5 days. It hastens recovery, although the final visual acuity of that episode is the same. But now we are aggressively intervening, because the initial presentation of other optic neuropathies like NMO or MOG is similar to optic neuritis, and delay treatment there can cause permanent severe visual loss. So I would say that now our management has changed to aggressively intervene in the form of steroids. And if the patient has a high chance of developing multiple sclerosis, interferons are a role which of course need to be given in association with a neurologist. You have a pale disc edema on the other hand compared to an hyperemic disc, you start thinking of an ischemic optic neuropathy. It could be a non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy or an arthritic ischemic neuropathy. Thankfully, we don't have that much arthritic conditions, and very few patients present to us with arthritic, and the bulk of the patients remain non-arthritic, and that's why that is more common. But always, when you have a presentation suspected ischemic, must differentiate arthritic from non-arthritic, because arthritic is an emergency and is one of those rare emergencies in which every hour will count. So if you have a patient you suspect arthritic, you need to start steroids immediately. We'll come to arthritic in a bit, but non-arthritic, you will have blurred central vision. The vision will be from absolutely normal but with a field effect to no PL. RAPD again is present and is an important hard sign to pick up neuropathy. Usually don't have significant pain but may have mild discomfort. The most common field that we see is an altitudinal defect, because you have sectoral involvement of the optic nerve. So again, in the upper photo, you can see there is edema inferiorly, and inferior involvement of the disc is there. The importance of NEIN is to identify risk factors, to manage risk factors, to prevent recurrent involvement in that same eye or the other eye, because there is not much by way of intervention to recovery of vision, at least at present. The key things you need to work up are for diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, sleep apnea syndrome, nocturnal hypotension. So particularly patients who are on antihypertensives should avoid taking their antihypertensives late into the night, because the normal hypotension at night will get added to by the antihypertensive drug. Small cup to disc ratio, so or small discs, we have a predisposition, they're called a disc at risk. Hypercoagulopathies, anemia, acute blood loss, and of course occasionally migraine, and smoking of course is a cause of a lot of evil, so smoking also has been associated. So these are key risk factors. Any patient coming to you with NEION suspected, these are key things that need to be eliminated. As I said, management is at the moment no definitive management for NEION, but the aim is, or the workup is to control risk factors, because 30% of these patients will have the other eye involvement in 5 years. There is no clear therapy at the moment that has any clear benefit. A lot of people have tried things like aspirin, steroids, anticoagulants, but at the moment there is no clear level 1 evidence that any of these actually have an effect on the long-term outcomes of the patient. And optic nerve sheath fenestration was tried in a very big multicentric trial, the ischemic optic neuropathy decompression trial, and they actually found poorer outcomes as compared to no treatment. Therefore, that is a definite no-no. Arthritic, a quick brief about arthritic, although it is not so common, but it's important to identify. Patients will present with sudden painless loss of vision. They may have some previous history of transient visual obscurations, but will have systemic associations like severe headache, jaw claudication, fever, scalp tenderness, loss of weight, appetite, because arthritic is part of a systemic inflammatory disease. That is why it is important to identify and will present with systemic features. So loss of weight, loss of appetite, scalp tenderness, these are very important history you will get. The vision will be severely affected. They have very severe visual loss as a classical feature. Severe, it's an afferent pupillary defect. It's not even relative. The pupil will just not constrict. And a swollen pale disc. The key investigations would be an increased ESR, C-reactive protein, and of course on FFA you will see delayed choroidal circulation. So a delayed choroidal flush is there because there is ischemia on the choroid also. And temporal artery biopsy will have lesions showing granulomatous involvement, but in a area where arthritic ischemic neuropathies are rare, and our experience of doing temporal artery biopsy is obviously even more less. So it's not such a diagnostic feature, and clinically you can pick it up with. So any patient presenting with ischemic neuropathy, remember ESR, CRP are a must if there is even slight suspicion of an arthritic. And when in doubt, just get these things done because they are more than 99% sensitive to pick up arthritic. The other features of arthritic, they're usually in more advanced stages. So they are older patients, although we see it in a little younger patients in our country, but still arthritics are much older. NAIONs are much younger. So we see them even in our 40s. I have had a patient of 35 or early 30s presenting with ischemic neuropathies, but non-arthritic. But arthritics usually would be more than 60 or 65 at least. Like I said, they have history of systemic involvement, transient visual obscurations, and very quickly bilateral involvement. That's why it's very important. The moment he presents, you start him on steroids because within 2 weeks, the other eye is going to get involved, and it's almost severely blinding, and they would have complete blindness if we do not intervene aggressively. And the treatment is an emergency to prevent blindness. You give high-dose steroids. Although many people have moved to trying or giving IV methylprednisolone, but a quick start with oral steroids are adequate. Although return of vision is rare, but we prevent further involvement of that eye and of course of the other eye, which is important. This is a disease which is a systemic disease, and therefore systemic assessment and involvement is important to look at any ischemic things that are happening in the rest of the body, because what granulomatous inflammation is happening on the optic nerve vessels is happening everywhere else, so including the heart and the brain. And this is a condition where 5-year mortality rates are described in ophthalmology. So again, very important to work up and manage these patients in association with an immunologist or a physician. And of course, this is a patient of ischemic neuropathy, which is non-arthritic. You can see the inferior pallor that is there. So this is showing an old ischemic neuropathy, and this is a disc at risk, a small disc, no cupping, and vessels are arising from the center and branching. So this is a small disc, it's a crowded disc. It is at risk of developing an ischemic neuropathy, and this is the field effect that you're seeing. So inferior pallor, a superior field effect. So depending upon the severity of the fibers that are involved, it can be a complete superior altitudinal defect, or that may be a central altitudinal defect. These are other appearances of the disc that you see. So here you have a myelinated nerve fibers. Again, there is obscuration of vision of the nerve of the blood vessels. Their margins are not clear. But again, if you see on a 3D picture, you will realize that there is no elevation of the disc, and these are following the nerve fibers. So again, we have been referred myelinated nerve fibers as papilledema or disc edema. It's important to be able to see them in a 3D. And this is a classical acute optic neuritis. You can see the edema is not so severe, but the margins are blurred compared to the other eye. So that's the classical acute optic neuritis that you see. This is the other differentials that you have. So a 40-year-old male presented with near difficulty, occasional headache. Who doesn't have a headache? All of us have headaches. So the moment this kind of a disc appearance was seen and a history of headache, he was diagnosed as papilledema. But when you look at it, there is no edema around the disc. This is just a lumpy, bumpy disc that we call. And on the ultrasound, you can see high 100% spikes showing a drusen of the optic nerve, and you can actually make out visible drusens on the irregular margins also. So it's a lumpy, bumpy disc of optic nerve drusens. Optic atrophy is not a disease; it's just a manifestation, and you can differentiate it on the appearance on primary, secondary, and cavernous. So primary is where the rest of the disc margins, everything is normal, which is kind of descending optic atrophy, which is seen in space occupying lesions, demyelination, post-toxic, nutritional, and hereditary. And it's a chalky white disc, margins are sharp, the disc is well demarcated and the cup is well demarcated, and over time there may be a loss of rim, therefore the cup may get enlarged. Whereas a secondary optic neuropathy, secondary to ischemic neuropathies, optic neuritis, post-papilledema, where you have the margins are not sharp, you can see gliosis that is along the disc vessels, and the peripapillary area looking not healthy at all, with these are called watermarks, old edema which is now absorbed, but there are watermarks there. So it's a dirty yellow, waxy looking, dirty white disc, blurred margins, obliterated cup, perivascular sheathing, retinal vessels are attenuated. This is secondary. And cavernous happens in glaucoma, a form of glaucoma. Of course, I mean, glaucoma can present with, and that's called a cavernous optic atrophy, methyl alcohol toxicity. So methyl alcohol damages the optic nerves. There is no inflammation. Over time, they just drop out and get lost, and therefore there is an excavated disc. And of course, you need to differentiate this from congenital anomalies like hypoplasia, colobomas, and even ICSOs like pituitary adenomas, which can present with a excavated disc over time. And again, just to know how a myelinated nerve fibers look, and again another optic nerve hypoplasia appearance. You can see this is called a double ring sign. This is not complete here. There is an inferior disc hypoplasia. This is the normal disc. This was the original disc per se. This part did not develop, and therefore it is covered by just the cells that are slid there. So the disc is, the true disc is only here, whereas this is the optic canal that was there. So this will very likely to have a superior field effect. So often they are misdiagnosed for either optic neuritis or glaucoma because of the classical field effect that they have. And just to tell you, you have workup of a patient. Patient presents with you, diminution of vision, both eyes. There is a history of extremities, numbness of the extremities, rest is okay. Systemic examination is fine. Right eye subnormal vision, left eye mildly subnormal, right RAPD is present, rest is normal. So you have bilateral temporal pallor. So because anyway we should image all patients, but because this is not a typical presentation, you have bilateral involvement, we will localize it to the brain, and this patient had a large pituitary macroadenoma. The atypical features were bilateral and temporal pallor. So always search for a cause for disc pallor the moment you have, a moment you pick up. It is always a sign of something going wrong or going on somewhere and needs to be picked up. Again, another very interesting patient. I think this is the last patient I have. A young adult who came to us with difficulty in reading. He just was having difficulty in reading. His vision was 6/6 when we took, but because of the temporal pallor, his field was done, and you can see these fields. This is a Goldman kinetic perimetry. This is the chalked out areas are the areas that are seen. So you can see a bitemporal hemianopia, and this patient was imaged for the sella, and he had a sellar tumor. So again, vision per se is not all there is to look at a patient in visual functions. Visual functions include visual acuity, color, contrast, fields, and stereo acuity. And any of this function, visual function, gets affected, it's important for you to investigate and identify. So that's all I had in presentation. So I'll stop share and I'll start my. So any questions or anything we have, or?
Thank you so much. One question is, the first one is, waxy disc pallor in RP.
Yeah, so it's called a waxy disc pallor because you have very slight changes happening on the disc because of the atrophy. So the reflectivity of the disc increases because initially there is damage to the photoreceptors, and then the connected bipolar cells and the ganglion cell layer slowly drop out and get lost. So it's a waxy disc pallor. It's a very unique kind of appearance, but often you may not even have, you may just have disc pallor. It may be sometimes difficult to differentiate a primary optic atrophy from a waxy disc pallor. It's just described because there is a little increased reflectivity of a disc in a retinitis pigmentosa. And of course, you'll have other signs of RP there. More classical is the arterial attenuation rather than what we call the bony spicules and all, because that may be a sign pigmento also. So arterial attenuation is a key characteristic feature of retinitis pigmentosa, and the optic atrophy is responsible for the visual loss besides the photoreceptor damage. Yeah, so temporal disc pallor. So temporal disc pallor per se may not always be significant, but again, it's key to do a visual functions the moment you have any disc pallor that may be temporal. So temporal disc pallor is essentially signifying damage or injury to the papillomacular bundle. And papillomacular bundle is subserving the fovea and the macula. So you're looking at higher visual functions like color, contrast, central fields, and stereo acuity. If these are normal, the temporal disc pallor may just be that because there are less number of vessels coming from the temporal side of the disc, because the foveal avascular zone has less vessels there. So normally also you may have a little pallor on the temporal side because the vascularity is less coming from that side. Vessels are less coming from that side. But the moment you have a visual functional deficit, you must consider it significant.
Anybody wants, they can unmute and ask directly also. Or you can write in the chat box as you is comfortable.
लेस क्वेश्चन से डर लगता है कि या तो समझ ही नहीं आया या इतना अच्छा बोला वो जरा चांस कम होता है.
Matter is true. इतना बढ़िया बोला कि पूछने की कोई जरूरत ही नहीं.
वो मैंने कहा वो ऐसा कभी होता नहीं, वो हकीकत में कभी हो नहीं सकता. Especially when it comes to neurology. Yeah.
I have one question here. Can you give us the broad details like when to go for MRI with contrast or fat suppression and like little bit, yeah.
So again, see, neurology always the key thing is, or neuro-ophthalmology key thing is that you should have an idea what you are trying to image. Because now there are so many options as far as imaging is concerned that you need to have a directed investigation. Moreover, your radiologist must know what to focus on. So if you're looking at visual functional deficit, now if you're thinking of optic neuritis or something that is responsible for visual loss, you want to image the visual pathway. So the visual pathway right from the optic disc right to the occipital lobe. So this anywhere along this tract, there can be a lesion. So ideally, if you suspect optic neuritis or anything like NMO or anything that may be there affecting the visual function, our basic investigation would be an MRI brain with contrast, with MRI orbits, with fat suppression, so that you are able to see the entire visual pathway. So the fat suppression will ensure that the fat reflectivity will not come in the way of assessing the optic nerve. and the contrast and flare. So normally the moment you say fat suppression, they will also do a fluid. It automatically will reduce the fluid in signals also. So you will have a flare image also of the brain. So you will be able to see delineate the visual pathway as it goes along the ventricles right up to the occipital lobe. So this is a basic investigation that you will do. It will help us to pick up multiple sclerosis, help us to rule out any space occupying lesions anywhere along the visual pathway, and give us an idea about other things. But if you are imaging for other things, like you will have a motility defect discussion tomorrow, then you need to localize or identify where. We've had cases which had, say, a suspected tumor in the midbrain and were advised in basic baseline MRI, and the midbrain was not imaged and the lesion was missed, and subsequently we repeated the imaging and we realized that that was missed because of the previous. So MRI can also miss if it is not directed. And the other investigation available is a CT that is far lower at cost, but that is only useful when you're looking at, when you have a very high suspicion of a space occupying lesion, because for MS or any detailed investigation or understanding of the visual pathway, a CT is a very, very poor modality. If you're thinking of orbit, a CT would probably score over an MRI because of the bony presence there. So MRI has a lot of bony artifacts that orbit cannot pick up easily. So if you've localized the lesion onto the orbit on any side, a CT would suffice. It's low cost, fast, easy to get done, and adequately telling what the pathology may be. But brain, preferably go for an MRI with contrast.
Thank you so much, sir. But if we have a case of, say, papilledema, where we want to see the visual function, like the entire visual pathway, along with the optic, any tumor which is there in the brain or anything in the orbit, in that case, which one we should go for?
No, so papilledema, again, same, MRI brain with orbits with contrast, and fat suppression again, because otherwise the optic nerve will not be delineated. This will show you the entire visual pathway. This is the most common investigation that we order. If you are, even for papilledema, so it will rule out a space occupying lesion. It will help us to pick up if there is any IIH or a fluid overload by way of distended optic nerve sheaths, and an empty sella, which is a soft sign for a raised intracranial pressure. However, if you suspect IIH and that's what it comes out to be, the patient will need to be added on an MRV. MR venogram is important because you need to rule out a cavernous sinus thrombosis. So, of course, not in all patients of I would say not in all patients of papilledema, although some people say that if you have a high chance of IIH, you would advise an MRV. But you could mention that query IIH, and if there is no tumor that is found on the MRI, the radiologist can go ahead and proceed with an MRV, because that is the other key thing that you need to investigate for.
I have one more question here, sir. Many a times we see pregnant women with papilledema. So, considering the risk associated with all these investigations, what exactly we should do in that case?
Sure. So we need to understand what is the reason why a pregnant woman is having raised intracranial pressure. So that cannot be physiological. The venous return cannot be so low as to raise intracranial pressure, and of course it needs to be raised intracranial pressure would be a part of a PIH, a pregnancy-induced hypertension causing a grade 4 hypertensive retinopathy or even a raised intracranial pressure. So presence of papilledema, that's where the key so that's one condition where your intervention actually changes the course of management. If you find papilledema, the advice invariably would be to deliver the baby. It is a key thing. That's why be sure when you're looking at papilledema in a pregnant woman. No, there is no other real reason unless you're looking at tumors or something. If the patient is a patient of hypertension and you're suspecting PIH, papilledema itself indicates that you need to get remove the PIH cause for PIH. And I mean, it's very, very rare tumors to be there. But if it's very early in pregnancy and you think that it could be tumors, then of course an MRI is safe enough, and gist of the brain would be adequate to pick up tumors. But again, I would say that that's an extremely rare, unusual presentation for papilledema in a pregnant woman.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, so there's a question of how long, Abhishek has asked, how long it takes for papilledema and papillitis to resolve with medication. So papilledema, once you start Diamox acetazolamide on full doses, again, it's weight dependent. Unfortunately, neurologists are rather touchy about giving acetazolamide. They're very scared of it. Whereas we give it to our congenital glaucoma children also. So we have a infant taking, quarter tablet or half a tablet 3 times or whatever. So we are not so scared of Diamox. So the moment you start acetazolamide, give it the full dose. You need to give high doses, start early. The effect will come within 2 weeks. You'll start seeing a reduction in the first week itself. So you do a visual examination, now start acetazolamide, see 1 week later, see the symptomatic improvement. You would have seen some improvement in the edema, and by 2 weeks, it would show definite signs of improvement, and it should resolve by another 1 to 3 months. After that, you need to follow up the patient for a while, and if the subsequent 3 months there is no significant edema, you can start thinking of tapering the acetazolamide very gradually. There is always the risk of rebound increase, so it has to be very gradual and followed. So you could, monthly reduce the amount of the acetazolamide you're giving and have a monthly visit to see the fields or the fundus exam. Papillitis will, if you're giving IV methylprednisolone, you'll see improvement in visual functions by the 3rd or 4th day. Very immediate and very sudden rise of improvement of vision by the first dose itself raises suspicion that it may not be a demyelinating and maybe inflammatory, because that responds far faster than demyelinating, and therefore you may worry about that. But usually by the 3rd dose or the 4th, 5th day, the patient will give significant visual improvement. The edema will within a week will be much better, and by 2 weeks you will have very little or no edema, although the OCT may still pick up some changes. But if given treatment, papillitis will improve very rapidly. RAPD will take time. VEP will take time to come back. They say up to a year and sometimes never. And RAPD may take up to 3 months to 6 months to become absolutely normal. But visual functions improve significantly within 3 to 5 days.
Sir, I have one last question. It's regarding the ONTT trial. They have recommended 3 days of IV methylprednisolone, followed by 11 days of tablet oral prednisolone, 1 milligram per kg body weight. So we need to taper only after 11 days, or we can taper in between also.
So actually, if you understand the ONTT had given the 11 days oral steroids and no taper after that. They just stopped the 11 days oral steroid. They just had halved it on the subsequent week and just stopped, because they wanted to balance the 14-day oral steroid treatment of the oral steroid arm. Because at the start in 1990, they were not sure what will do better. These were the options that were being given. So orals, if they felt that if they compare 3 days IV methylprednisolone with 14-day oral steroid and the 14-day oral steroid performs better, then there would be a confounder as to duration of steroid an impact. So 14-day versus 3 days. So they continued the oral taper. So they gave a total of 14 days of oral steroids in both the arms. But obviously the IV methylprednisolone performed better. So as such, there is no real indication for giving oral steroids for any prolonged period of time. Over time, our understanding of diseases and the presence, especially in India, of NMO, neuromyelitis optica, inflammatory optic neuropathies has come. So we realize that patients may require to be given oral steroids for a much longer period. But if it's demyelinating optic neuritis, you can give IV methylprednisolone for 3 to 5 days and stop there and then, especially if the patient has, issues like if he's a diabetic, then I would not give an oral steroid at all. However, if the patient has not so great visual improvement, or I think that there is suspicion that he has an inflammatory optic neuropathy, I may continue the oral steroids for a longer period, do a gradual taper. But as per the ONTT and for interventions from multiple sclerosis, 3 to 5 days IV methylprednisolone with an 11-day oral steroid for a total 14-day period is what is recommended from the trial basis. But of course, our treatment is now evolving, over time, and it's a little case by case which we give.
Okay, so for a typical case, we can just stop it after 11 days.
Yes, absolutely. You can just do a sudden stop also. There is no need to taper. Yeah. If there is insufficient visual improvement, you may consider a taper.
Then we can continue with.
But otherwise, 14 days, you just stop the treatment.
Stop it. Thank you, sir. And how is the IV dexamethasone response in comparison to?
So, two of our studies which we had done at RP Center, we had found it the result, the short-term result up to 6 months to 1 year being equivalent to IV methylprednisolone. Of course, we were doing it at that time when we evaluated it at the time when methylprednisolone was not so easily available. So if you have any problems in excess or affordability of methylprednisolone, dexamethasone does just as well, 200 milligrams. However, if you don't have an accessibility or an affordability issue, considering that the neurologists are very, very touchy about methylprednisolone, I would say that give methylprednisolone if available and possible for you to do. Dexamethasone works just as well, but because long-term studies are not available in dexamethasone, therefore neurologists per se are a little hesitant to accept dexamethasone. Although even the ONTT finally in their final report said that whatever steroid you give IV in any form does not make a difference. So really it doesn't make a difference, but because you have 15-year results of methylprednisolone and the other studies which have gone on to work on immunomodulators have taken methylprednisolone, so the first choice would be methylprednisolone. Is there a mannitol in papilledema? So sure, if you have a very, very severe raised intracranial pressure, we've had patients presenting with 900 and the normal would be 250 mm of water. So we've had patients with 900 and we don't know more because 900 was the upper limit of the manometer. So yes, IV mannitol will bring it down suddenly. But as a long term, it's not a good intervention to do because it only lasts 4 to 6 hours. And the other indication for mannitol would be if there is sulfur allergy. So before you give Diamox, please ask for sulfur allergy of the patient because Diamox is a sulfur based drug, and long term, if you give for long periods, there is a risk of a Steven Johnson or something like that. So it's important only in conditions where Diamox is not possible. So if you can't give acetazolamide, you need to look at alternatives, and mannitol for acute management is a possibility.
Do you want to unmute and ask the question directly?
Hello, sir. Sir, Kestenbaum index, is it really useful, sir?
So the Kestenbaum index tells us about the fine capillary network on the surface of the disc, and had graded it clinically to pick up optic atrophy. So that was the purpose of the Kestenbaum index, and it was of course described at a time when we had none of these newfangled investigations that we now so heavily rely on. So it was a clinical assessment of the disc for them to be able to pick up early optic atrophy. So if you have a reduced Kestenbaum number, you know that something is happening with the disc. So at the in the present world and the present circumstance, I would say that a Kestenbaum's number is not a very clinically useful parameter anymore. But of course, from an exam point of view, it is important. And of course, if you don't have access to a good fundus photographs, or now we're doing, like I said, the more key thing is visual function. So if you are not able to assess fine visual functions, you may look at Kestenbaum's number. But now its clinical role is less because you do OCTs, you're able to pick up nerve fiber layer defect much earlier than the subsequent visual the vessel loss that will happen. So less useful, but an important thing to know, especially from an exam point of view. Satyajit has to sit through a lot of neuro-ophthalmology. Satyajit, you're mute. I can't.
Sorry, I said I am learning so much through all these classes.
Yeah.
3 months.
Absolutely.
YouTube viewership has crossed 10,000 views.
Oh wow! Amazing, Satyajit. All your charm.
A lot of people write to me that in the night they sit and see this on the YouTube and they are able to discuss in the hostel, and all the postgraduates talk about the various points that are discussed in the presentations. But it's all because of esteemed faculty like yourself.
Initiative and the background work is the key. यार बाकी सब चीजें तो होती रहती हैं, सब इधर-उधर बोलते रहते हैं, but have a dedicated postgraduate program, especially in these times where we have been struggling to teach our postgraduates. It's very useful, especially an interactive program. So this neuro-ophthalmology week, I'll say, if you have any doubts, tomorrow you have Rashman, you have Virender subsequently, you have Naveen Jaykumar subsequently. So, if you have any questions which don't get answered today, all neuro-ophthalmology is connected, and all are super speakers that you are getting access to in this. So you can just go on and ask questions tomorrow or day after. So it's a wonderful, fantastic initiative by Satyajit, and I think it's superb and really helping postgraduate education in a big way.
Vijay is also there.
So agar kuch, I think they are done with neuro-ophthalmology for the day.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the postgraduates who were in attendance. And most of all, I want to thank Dr. Rohit Saxena, Professor Rohit Saxena, for this amazing presentation and for the time and the effort that he put in to bring this all together. We are very, very grateful to you, Dr. Rohit. We are also very grateful to Intas Pharmaceuticals, Manish ji, for bringing this together. And tomorrow we have Dr. Rashmin Gandhi, who will be from Center for Sight in Hyderabad, and he is also associated with Foresight Worldwide. And he will be talking on ocular motility problems, which will be an interesting topic. And as Dr. Rohit said, if you have some questions, you can write to me. I can forward it to him, and he can reply. Dr. Rashmin can reply, or anybody. But thank you once again so much, Dr. Rohit, for the beautiful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Satyajit. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.